Hello, everyone. Welcome back to The Victim's Voice. Today, we will be finishing up the series on the death of Crystal McCrory. Last week, we talked about how West Carroll Parish was not going to let the state step in and look at Crystal's case, because even though they had told Crystal's family that the case would never be closed, they told the state that it was in fact closed. They also stated that there was no criminal activity, basically saying there's nothing to investigate here. We also talked about how Jana began filling out FOIA requests to obtain the files that should have been released to her from the beginning. After obtaining some of those files, more questions were raised when it came to the ballistics report and the crime scene photos, which we went over last episode. We ended the episode by talking about some of the interviews that a private investigator, Angela Rothman, conducted during the month of September of 2023. Interviews that directly connected Tony and even his friend Chuck Harris to some questionable behaviors with underage girls. This week, we're going to start by talking about Frank Peretti. He is the pathologist that conducted Crystal's autopsy and also the one that made all of the mistakes on the autopsy report. On December 25th of 2023, Jana reached out to Peretti by email. She wanted to bring his attention to the incorrect information and discrepancies that were on the autopsy report. Her first name is spelled Crystal with an H in the report, but her legal spelling is Crystal. Her hair is listed as being blondish brown and her eyes as hazel, but her hair was black and her eyes almost just as black. It states that her cervical, thoracic, and lumbar spine showed no obvious fractures or abnormalities, when in fact she had a major car accident 12 years before that broke several bones in her back and put her in a quote unquote turtle shell back brace for quite some time. It also states that her vagina, cervix, uterus, fallopian tubes, and ovaries are unremarkable, when in fact she had recently undergone a full hysterectomy less than a year before she passed away. On her extremities, it mentions no abnormalities, but when Jana and Julie saw her body to prepare her hair and makeup before her viewing, there was bruising on her inner thighs and around her wrist, particularly her right one, along with a completely missing fingernail on her freshly manicured hands. The next day, on December 26th, Jana got a response that said they were looking into the matter and would get back to her within a day or two. On December 28th, when Jana still had not heard back from anyone in Peretti's office, she sent another email asking if there had been any updates. Later on that same day, she received an email from Peretti. Here is what he said. I am responding to your email dating December 25th, 2023. Response to question 1. On the investigative report, her name was spelled Crystal with an H. I have changed the spelling to Crystal without an H. Response to question 2. My notes state her hair was black. This was a transcription error and has been corrected. Eye color changes after death, and they appeared hazel at the time of autopsy. Response to question number 3. There were no documented skeletal fractures while examining the interior vertebral bodies. Fractures may have involved the posterior vertebral bodies, which we do not examine unless we are informed prior to autopsy. Response to question number 4. My autopsy notes state she had a hysterectomy. This correction has been made to the autopsy report. Response to question number 5. There was no bruising on her inner thighs or waist. What you were seeing was postmortem lividity, the settling of blood after death. I did not see a missing fingernail at the time of autopsy. The fingernail may have been lost during the handling of the body post-autopsy. This was Jana's response to his return email. Thank you for your response. I do have an image of her missing fingernail on her left hand from a crime scene photo taken by the coroner of West Carroll Parish. The bruising on her hand also wasn't there in the crime scene photo, but appeared 6 days later during her funeral preparation. After all of the miscommunications and straight out lies that Jana and her family had been dealing with ever since Crystal's death, Jana contacted the Fair Fight Initiative. This is an organization that, along with other things, helps people who have not been treated fairly by law enforcement. Attorneys David Utter and Chris Morrell from the Fair Fight Initiative did their own investigation into Crystal's death, which included reviewing all of the documents that were available to them through the records request. After they were done with their research, they sent a letter to Sheriff Scott Matthews, District Attorney Penny Douciere, and the Louisiana State Police. In the letter, they state that based on their review of the case, the role that Crystal's husband, Tony Jones, played in her death was insufficiently investigated for a matter this serious, and the determination that he played no role is unreliable. Utter and Murrell list their credentials in regards to homicide investigations. With nearly 20 years of experience, on top of serving as lead capital trial counsel on several cases and being the executive director of the Capital Appeals Project, it sounds like these guys know what they're doing. They go on to implore the offices to reopen Crystal's case and to look more closely at Tony, as his behavior before and after Crystal's death was not consistent with an innocent, grieving husband. They list the issues that should have put Tony on the sheriff and DA's radar from the beginning, such as lying about his whereabouts on the day that Crystal died, how he attempted to recover a life insurance policy the day after she died, and how he made overt and blatantly inappropriate sexual advances to the women who were trying to help him in the days following Crystal's death. They also stated that Tony's behavior is even more suspicious because of the physical evidence that was collected. They talked about how photographs of Crystal's body show the formation of bruises on her hands and on her inner thighs, as well as a missing fingernail on her freshly manicured left hand. Bruising is not possible post-mortem, so the bruising had to have happened when Crystal was still alive, suggesting a fight or struggle where Crystal might have been defending herself. This letter goes on to lay everything out clearly, and because this has been a multiple episode case with a lot of information thrown at you, I'm going to highlight the letter in order of events to give you all a recap of the case and show you how clear it is that Crystal's death does not look like a suicide, and that Tony should have at the very least been a person of interest or a suspect. They start by talking about before Crystal's death and how Crystal suspected Tony of being unfaithful, so she had started tracking his movements. They also talked about how Tony and Crystal were having financial problems and how Tony, not Crystal, called to get her job back at State Farm just 3 weeks before her death. He thought that she would automatically have a life insurance policy once she went back to work, which he checked on the day after her death. They also talked about the issues they were having with Tony's daughter Cheyenne, and how Tony was overly affectionate with her and how it made Crystal very uncomfortable. The letter goes on to talk about the day Crystal died and how she made a doctor's appointment because she wasn't feeling good when she woke up that morning. But she drank coffee, took a bath, did her hair and makeup. At 10:06 a.m., Tony said he spoke to Crystal for 15 to 20 minutes. It was during this time, or shortly after, that Crystal was shot in the head. The coroner initially listed that Crystal's body was found at 10:35 a.m., but 5:05 p.m. was handwritten in its place. The death certificate, however, based on the science and training of those who are deemed fit to establish a time of death, lists Crystal's time of death as 11 a.m. They talk about Tony's inconsistent statements to law enforcement. Tony was the last person to see Crystal alive at around 8 a.m. Law enforcement questioned him about his whereabouts and activities on that day. There are several changes and omissions in what he told them, such as in his recorded interview, he never mentioned stopping to get a haircut on his way from Bastrop. Yet, in Officer Alan Irby's investigative report, it states that once Tony got to Oak Grove, he deposited a check at Regions Bank. The receipt shows he did this at 10:51 a.m. He then got a haircut, and after that, went to the bakery barn for lunch. However, according to his Google timeline information, the very first thing he did when he got back to Oak Grove was drive to 315 East Main Street. This is the address of the West Carroll Parish Sheriff's Department. He was at that address for 9 minutes before continuing on with his day. He never mentions that stop in his recorded interview, and it's also not mentioned in the investigative report or either police report, even though they were the investigating authority. Also, when Sheriff Matthews was asked about Tony's stop at his office, he can't remember him being there. Isn't that convenient? Tony had a job to do at Darrell Billings' house in Bastrop on the morning of the night. The private investigator, Angela Rothman, interviewed Billings and he told her that Tony was late getting to his house that morning and that he had to call him to see where he was. However, Tony told law enforcement that he is the one that called Billings that morning, just to let him know that he was on his way. You know what simple solution would have resolved these contradicting accounts of that morning? Checking Tony's phone records. That's what. But that was never done. They then talk about the fact that Tony checked Cheyenne out of school that day, even though she was always a bus rider. This was because he was supposedly doing work at the school, even though his LCC was suspended. He did, however, make sure to have contact with the school resource officer while he was there. Was this for alibi purposes? The letter goes on to talk about Tony's aimless drive around Oak Grove that afternoon, taking 35 minutes to get to Sonic when it's only a 9-minute drive normally. They also talk about his random trip to the Walmart parking lot. And Cheyenne was with him on his little trip around Oak Grove. So why did law enforcement never speak to her about where they went or how her dad was acting? They talk about how Tony said he called the clinic at 3:45 p.m. to see if Crystal had made it to her 2 o'clock appointment. Yet Crystal's laptop showed that he didn't even look up the number for the clinic until 4:15 p.m. Tony also made no attempts to call and check on Crystal before this time, even though he told law enforcement that he did. This would be another detail they could have confirmed had they checked Tony's phone records. Tony leisurely drove around Oak Grove all afternoon without calling or going by the house and checking on Crystal. But then at 4:23 p.m., he decided to call his buddy Chuck Harris to go check on her. According to Tony, he was on the phone with Harris the entire time. But that's not what Harris said. He said that when he couldn't get anyone to answer the door at Tony Crystal's house, he called Tony back. This is when Tony told him that the door was unlocked and gave him directions to where the bedroom was located in the house. Harris's arrival time to the Joneses' home was listed on the report as 4:33 p.m., and dispatch was called to report a death at 4:35 p.m. If Tony was on the phone with Harris that whole time, then how did Harris call 911? At 4:37 p.m., Tony left the undetermined address in Oak Grove, and at 4:41 p.m., Harris said he called Tony back again to tell him that Crystal was dead. When he asked Tony where he was at the time, he said he was at the karate studio with a class full of kids, which is where he said that he had been since 4 p.m., waiting on Crystal to arrive for the class. But his phone pings show that that is absolutely a lie. Why does law enforcement not question all of these discrepancies? And not just that, why would they tell Jana and Dane that they were irrelevant? It took Tony 14 minutes to drive home after getting the call that his wife was dead. That is exactly how long it would take for him to get home from his location if he were going the speed limit. He didn't rush to get home at all. It then took Tony 42 minutes to drive the 12.2 miles to the sheriff's department for his 7-minute interview just a couple of hours later. Where else did he go and who did he talk to during those 42 minutes? All of these questions could be answered had law enforcement taken Tony's phone and analyzed it as they would have done in any other case. They then go on to talk about Tony's conduct in the days after Crystal's death, which was contrary to what we would expect from a grieving spouse. Tony's only concerns in the days after his wife's death was money, gaining money while spending the least amount possible on his wife's final resting place and satisfying his sexual desires. In the first few days after Crystal's death, Tony was concerned with checking to see if she had a life insurance policy. When he found out that she didn't, he then moved on to try to get some of the donation money that Jana had raised through the GoFundMe for the funeral expenses. Just 4 days after Crystal's death, on February 13th, Tony Googled what is the appropriate time to date after the death of a spouse. On the 14th, Valentine's Day, and just 5 days after her death, Tony sent suggestive and sexually explicit text messages to one of the women who was just trying to be kind and brought food to Tony's house, under the assumption that he was a grieving husband, when in reality, he was just a nasty, murderous, perverted piece of shit. That last part was not in the letter from the lawyer. The lawyers wrapped up the letter by stating that although none of these facts in and of themselves prove foul play beyond a reasonable doubt, they do in fact cast a large doubt on the idea that Crystal unprovoked committed suicide. They stated that an investigation of Tony's cell phone activity, analysis of the computers in the Joneses' home, and of Tony's social media accounts would be necessary for a complete and accurate determination of what, if any, role that Tony had in Crystal's death. They went over every detail, every discrepancy that showed Tony was full of shit. These lawyers laid it all out plain as day. The only way they could have done it any better would be if they had drawn law enforcement a picture. And maybe that's what they should have done, because the letter didn't change anything. In fact, on May 5th, 2024, Jana and Sheila Wysocki, the lead cold case private investigator in the country who was looking into Crystal's case, took a trip to Washington, D.C. to advocate for Crystal, along with members of other families who had loved ones whose cases were not investigated properly. Jana had been turned away by the West Carroll Parish Sheriff, the DA, and the state police. So she was going over all of their heads to the lawmakers to try to get someone to look at Crystal's case. On May 6th, while in Washington, Jana gave a speech to Senator Bill Cassidy's councilman. On that very same day, Louisiana State Police sent a letter to Jana. This letter stated that even though they have the discretion to open an investigation, they usually provide support or take over matters from local agencies at their request when they are unable to effectively investigate the matter with the resources that they have at their disposal. They go on to say that in March of 2023, they made an initial inquiry at the request of Jana. They said that they reached out to the West Carroll Parish Sheriff's Office, the District Attorney's Office for the 5th District, and to Jana. They said that they reviewed the letter from David Utter and Chris Merrill and also looked into their initial review. And with that being said, they were not going to pursue an investigation into the case. This is absolutely crazy. How much more evidence do they need to at least believe that Tony should be looked into and a more thorough investigation should happen? On June 17, 2024, Sheriff Matthews retained counsel, and a letter from his attorney was sent to Sheila Wysocki. She had asked for the release of certain documents for the family. The first request was for a copy of any written correspondence between the sheriff's office and attorneys David Utter and Chris Merrill. Of course, they denied it, saying that any such correspondence would not be considered public record. But then there was one part of the response to this request that stood out to me. This is what it said. Mrs. Jones' death has been ruled a suicide at this time. We are informed that a criminal investigation was undertaken by the sheriff's office with respect to this death, but thus far the investigation has not yielded sufficient information upon which a criminal prosecution could be based as of this writing. What? When was a criminal investigation done by the sheriff's office? Or even started? An hour and 45 minutes after Crystal was found deceased, law enforcement said it was a suicide. They interviewed Tony for 7 minutes, and at the beginning of the interview, Chief Irby said it was a self-inflicted gunshot wound. So when did this so-called criminal investigation take place? And how do they not have sufficient evidence to base a criminal prosecution? Jana and Dane handed them all of the evidence that they had from Crystal's computer. That would have been a good place to start. They did have an autopsy, retrieve the front part of the bullet from the wall, although that was not the same day, and after they left the crime scene unattended overnight. They did a 7-minute interview with Tony, and 9 days later, they interviewed Daryl Billings, the man in Bostrup that Tony did work for that morning. This is what they called a thorough investigation. This letter also states that the case is not closed and remains open and is subject to possible additional action if ever sufficient evidence is provided or discovered. Well, Jana provided them with sufficient evidence, but they said it was irrelevant. And how do they plan on discovering any new leads if they never did and are never going to investigate? The response continues by saying that after careful consideration, it has been determined that the letter by David Utter and Chris Murrell does not contain sufficient evidence to reactivate the investigation. How is this even possible? The letter outlines every which way that Tony should be looked into and the reasons why. They basically say that the letter is now part of a file that could be reactivated if any evidence was eventually found that could bring charges, so therefore, they weren't going to release the letter or the correspondences between the lawyers. This lawyer, like Sheriff Matthews, liked to throw in asshole comments. Like, for the case to be reactivated, there must be actual evidence and not mere innuendo or personal suspicions. I'm sorry, but nothing that Jana and Dane or the two lawyers brought forward were mere innuendo or personal suspicions. It was a fact based physical timeline that shows Tony lied. It was his actions after Crystal's death. It was a lot of red flags, but they were all concrete. The second request made by Sheila Wysocki was copies of any and all communications, such as emails, letters, and meeting minutes, between the sheriff's office and legal counsel regarding FOIA compliance, procedures, or specific requests. They denied this request, also saying it violated attorney client privilege. The third request was the names of all attorneys and law firms on retainer with the West Carroll Parish Sheriff. This was simply answered by the sheriff as none. 5 months later, on November 25th of 2024, a segment about Crystal's story was covered by Sophia Ridley from KNOE Channel 8. They talked about what a shoddy investigation the sheriff's department did on Crystal's case. The few crime scene photos, the dog in the bed with Crystal's body, the sheriff lying about the shell casing being visible in the photo when it was obviously not. Ridley stated that she reached out to the sheriff several times for an interview to see if he could explain some of the errors in the investigation. He finally agreed to talk, but then on the day of their scheduled interview, he wouldn't answer her calls. He later told her that he was no longer interested in speaking. And this is why people doubt law enforcement and feel that they do shady shit. If they are doing what they're supposed to do and everything's on the up and up, then why not have full transparency? Why be so secretive? KNOE also reached out to the sheriff several times for a copy of their policy and procedures manual on how they handle homicides and suicides, and got no response. Finally, they did get a response from Sheriff Matthews, and he stated that they did not deny the request for the manual. They simply did not have those records to provide her. How is this possible? No one has any clue where they keep the manual? I feel like that manual should be used in a big part of their training. Maybe this is why they don't know how to investigate. No one can find the manual. On December 26, 2024, I reached out to Sheriff Matthews to find out the status of Crystal's case. Here is what he said. No current status of the case to report and or to provide to you. I have no update or change in the case proceedings to report and or to provide to you. I have no documentation or correspondence related to the case status to report or to provide to you. That's it. That's all he had to say. So at this point in time, Jana doesn't even know if the case is still considered open or not. They have changed it so many times and now won't even give her an answer. Then, around the second anniversary of Crystal's death, Jana did something that really pissed off Sheriff Matthews. She had two bulletin boards put up, one in Oak Grove, where Tony and Sheriff Matthews and Irby would have to see it every day. She also put one up in Bastrop. The board said, "Justice for Crystal McCrory. Justice, truth, and accountability." At the bottom, it asked the question, why didn't she deserve a proper investigation? As soon as the boards were put up, Sheriff Matthews went to the place that rents out the billboards and demanded that the one in Oak Grove be taken down. He was told that they couldn't do that since it was paid for a certain amount of time. I believe Jana said it was 2 or 3 months. And you best believe when that time was up, Matthews was right there again, making sure it was taken down. Why was Matthews so angry about the sign if he had nothing to hide, and if they did in fact do a proper investigation? But Jana wasn't done yet. On February 21st, 2025, she filed a complaint with the Arkansas Board of Medical Examiners, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, and the Arkansas Attorney General's Office against pathologist Dr. Frank Peretti for the discrepancies and inconsistencies in Crystal's case. In the complaints, Jana specifies all of the discrepancies that Dr. Peretti listed in the autopsy report, and the fact that Crystal's body was cremated on February 20th, 2023, and the initial autopsy didn't even come out until 2 days later on February 22nd of 2023. This left them unable to get a second opinion or further forensic testing. 3 days later, Jana got her first response to these complaints. It was from the Arkansas AG's office. It simply said, quote, "Thank you for contacting the Arkansas Attorney General's office regarding Dr. Frank Peretti. The situation you describe in your complaint falls outside the Consumer Protection Division's role and authority. We are not able to facilitate a resolution of your complaint." End quote. 3 days after this, on February 27th of 2025, Jana received a response from the DOJ Civil Rights Division in regards to the complaint that was filed. They basically said the same thing as the AG, that the situation that Jana described doesn't appear to be within the jurisdiction of the federal civil rights laws that they enforce, and therefore there was nothing that they could do. It seemed like every door that Jana knocked on slammed in her face, but she was not going to give up, ever. On March 6th of 2025, she emailed the city of Oak Grove to see if they would talk to her about Crystal's death. They responded the same day and stated that because Crystal's death happened outside of the city limits, it was out of their jurisdiction. On April 5th, Jana received a response from the National Association of Medical Examiners regarding the complaint against Peretti. The letter states that the complaint is not well-founded and therefore will be dismissed. They chalked the mistakes up to poor office processes and not unethical practices deserving of an ethical violation by Dr. Peretti. On April 14th of 2025, Jana got a response from the Arkansas State Medical Board. They stated that they can only take action against a physician's license if the medical care rendered by the physician rises to the level of gross negligence or ignorant malpractice, as defined as it is carelessness or recklessness to a degree that shows utter indifference to the consequences that may result. They determined there was no probable cause to bring charges against Frank Peretti. As usual, Jana didn't take no for an answer and wrote a rebuttal against the Arkansas Medical Board's decision. She pointed out several important details that they should take into consideration and not overlook, such as how they had never received page 2 of Crystal's toxicology report, despite all of the records requests they had filed. This page would list the levels of medications that Crystal had in her system at the time of her death. She also mentioned how Peretti had altered the autopsy report 10 months after Crystal's death, including changes to critical observations such as livor mortis findings and case numbers. The alterations were made without informing the family and only came to light after they had compared the two autopsy reports. She then tells them that their response appears to dismiss the significance of these changes and fails to adequately address the ethical and procedural implications of postmortem report modifications, particularly when these changes involve inconsistencies that directly contradict earlier forensic documentation. She also brings up the fact that Dr. Peretti claimed that in his notes it said that Crystal had had an hysterectomy. She states that there was no way he had that in his notes because it was not true, and her medical records confirm it. Crystal had actually had an abdominal ablation shortly before her death. Dr. Peretti changed that part of the autopsy report because Jana had told him Crystal had a hysterectomy by mistake in one of their emails, which is not the way he should be collecting his information. Jana's persistence finally paid off. On May 9th, 2025, she received a letter regarding her rebuttal. It stated that they were recommending that it be returned to the board for further review on June 5th and 6th. They said they would contact Jana within 2 weeks of any decision or ruling. But, once again, they came back with the same decision. Maybe if it was easier to hold these officials accountable for their actions, then they would not make such careless mistakes. On January 1st of this year, Jana received something amazing, a little glimmer of hope to bring in the new year with, a hope that the status of this case is going to change soon. She received an email from Daniel O'Kelly, a court-recognized firearms expert, former ATF special agent, and director of the International Firearms Specialist Academy. He took a look at Crystal's case, and he pointed out all of the red flags that everyone else had been pointing out for the last 3 years. 1. That the possible suspect, Tony, was only interviewed for 7 minutes and is a former officer of the same police department. Number 2, inconsistencies in coroner's report. Number 3, Tony had financial difficulties and sought an insurance payout the day after death. Number 4, no canvassing of the neighborhood was ever done. Number 5, no GSR testing of Tony or Crystal. No blood splatter pattern established, and the death bullet went through a pillow before entering her head, which indicates either an attempt to suppress the gunshot or to prevent blood splatter pattern. Number 6, no suicide note was left, and it is also uncommon for women to commit suicide with a firearm, and especially not in their own home. Number 7, Tony's phone shows him very close to the home within minutes after having called Crystal that morning. Number 8, Tony did several things that are unusual in a seemingly effort to establish alibis all day, such as getting a haircut, stopping to eat 3 times during the workday, picking up his daughter from school, asking someone to check on Crystal rather than drive home and do it himself. He also told the person the door would be unlocked and to go directly to the bedroom where she was found. How would he know the door was unlocked and where in the house Crystal would be? He ended the email by saying he hopes by bringing these to their attention, it will prompt a new investigation concerning the possible corruption, cover-up, or ineptitude of the local police. After all of that, how can anyone say this case has been investigated properly? It's obvious that it wasn't from the beginning, because any law enforcement agency should know when there is an unattended death. They should always treat it like a homicide from the get-go, and then let the evidence lead them to what happened. If it turns out that it was a suicide, then so be it. But at least they did their due diligence. It's better to be overly thorough than to wish later down the line that they had done more. As of now, nothing has changed in Crystal's case. The ripple effect that Crystal's death caused is profound, at least for some people. Tony has moved on. He is still living in the house he shared with Crystal, and until recently, he was sharing it with his new fiancée. But he hasn't changed his ways and began cheating on her with someone new. And now he's made it official with the new girl. I'm sure she's one of those that think he could never cheat on her, though cheating should be the least of her concerns. Tony may have moved on, but Crystal's family who loved her can't. A piece of their hearts has been ripped out, and nothing will ever be able to repair the effects her death has had on them. Two boys have lost their mother. One of those sons, Corbin, had just found out that he was going to be a father shortly before Crystal's death, and now he doesn't have his mom to help and give advice. That child will never get to meet his grandma. Jana's daughters were close to their aunt, especially her youngest daughter. Even though they were only 8 and 10 when she died, they were still greatly affected by her death, and they still are. And there isn't anything anyone can say to make dealing with their loss easier. Even though nothing can bring Crystal back, having the person responsible for taking her life held accountable would help them get some kind of closure. But to this day, no one has been held accountable for Crystal's death, and law enforcement is still doing absolutely nothing about it. Sheriff Matthews doesn't speak to Jana anymore, but she sends him a message every year around the same time, asking about her sister's case. She knows she most likely won't get a response, but she wants to make sure he remembers Crystal's name and that he knows that Jana is never going to give up getting answers. And I want to urge all of you to help in the fight to get this family the answers they need. If everyone could spare a few minutes in your day to send the Attorney General, DA Douciere, and West County Parish Sheriff's Department an email demanding that this case be looked at again and investigated thoroughly, we can make a difference. We have to use our voices to stand up for what is right. And we can't keep letting these agencies who take an oath to protect us and who are supposed to have integrity get away with their unprofessional conduct, corruption, and botched investigations. Crystal's case is just one of many that this has happened to. I'm going to give you the email addresses now, and I will also post them on the Victim's Voice social media pages. DA Pennywise Douciere's email address is pdouciere, which is DOUCIERE, at 5thda.org. Sheriff Scott Matthews' email address is wcpso@yahoo.com. Please take a few minutes and reach out to these agencies and demand that they take another look at Crystal's case and investigate it properly, or even better, that they ask the state to take it over. If you would like to stay updated on Crystal's case, you can join the Justice for Crystal McCrory Facebook page or follow me on the Victim's Voice Facebook page, where I will let you know of any new information that's released. Please share this episode anywhere you can to keep Crystal's name and story out in the public. And please send those emails so we can put pressure on the public officials involved in this case to do the right thing. Sending positive energy to all of Crystal's loved ones, and I hope that they all get the answers they deserve and closure one day very soon. If you have a case you would like to recommend, message me or fill out the form on our webpage, the-victims-voice.org, and come back next week for a new case. Until then, stay safe and peace out.